The year 1857 was a time of suffocating heat and even more suffocating silence in the heart of Louisa County, Virginia. At the center of this world stood the Thornhill Plantation, a sprawling engine of tobacco and misery where every soul was measured by their utility. Among the hundreds of enslaved people, one figure stood out, not because she was fast, but because she was immense. Bessie Williams was a woman of nearly 280 pounds, a physical presence that commanded the space around her. To the overseers, she was a crippled cook, or a slow-moving ox, a human being reduced to a set of physical limitations. They saw her labored breathing and the way her joints groaned under her weight, and made a fatal assumption that she was a captive of her own body. They believed she was someone who could never run, someone for whom the very idea of flight was a physical impossibility. But beneath the layers of muscle and the heavy gait of a woman who had spent 38 years in forced labor, there was a mind of razor-sharp precision. Bessie was not just a worker, she was a witness. She spent her days in the tobacco barns and the kitchens, absorbing the rhythms of the plantation like a sponge. She knew the exact moment the night patrol changed shifts, the specific smell of the lead tracker's favorite tobacco, and the exact distance between the northern fence and the first deep creek. While others dreamed of freedom in abstract terms, Bessie was calculating it in miles, minutes, and ounces of dried meat. The geography of Virginia is a deceptive maze of rolling hills, dense pine forests, and treacherous marshlands. For a runaway, these woods were often a graveyard of hope. Most who fled did so in a fever of sudden terror, sparked by a lash or a threat of sale. They ran blindly into the dark, only to be run down by bloodhounds within 48 hours. Bessie watched these failed attempts with a heavy heart and a cold, analytical eye. She understood that speed was a luxury she didn't possess, so she replaced it with information. For 8 long years she had been building a mental map of the 4 surrounding counties. She knew which streams ran dry in August and which ones maintained a current strong enough to mask a scent. She had spent years cultivating invisible resources, stowing away scraps of flint, sharpening a small iron blade on the stones of the laundry fire, and hoarding salt to preserve meat. Her size, which the white men mocked, was actually a testament to her durability. She was a woman built of iron and oak, capable of lifting crates that made grown men stagger. She knew her body better than any doctor. She knew exactly how much strain her knees could take and how to pace her heartbeat during a long ascent. She wasn't preparing for a sprint. She was preparing for a siege. She was waiting for the one moment where the risk of staying became greater than the near certainty of death in the woods. On the Thornhill Plantation, the social hierarchy was enforced through a theater of power. Master Thornhill and his primary overseer, a man named Dixon, relied on the belief that they were omniscient. They believed they knew the hearts of their property as well as they knew the yield of their crops. To them, Bessie was a fixture of the landscape, as predictable as the rising sun. They spoke freely in front of her, discussing patrol routes and the habits of the local slave catchers as if she were a piece of furniture. This was their greatest mistake. Bessie memorized the names of the trackers, men like Preston Marsh, who boasted a near-perfect record of retrievals. She learned that Marsh relied on the arrogance of his hounds, trusting their noses more than his own intuition. She realized that the entire system of capture was built on the assumption that a runaway would behave like a frightened animal. They expected the enslaved to hide in the thickest brush, to move only at night, and to avoid human contact at all costs. Bessie's plan was the polar opposite. She would use the very thing that made her conspicuous, her size and her visibility, to create a cloak of normalcy. She understood the psychology of the hunter. They only look for what they expect to see. If she didn't look like a fugitive, they wouldn't see a fugitive. She was a master of the hidden in plain sight, a strategist who understood that the mind is the first gate to freedom. The atmosphere in the summer of 1857 was electric with tension. The air was thick with the scent of curing tobacco and the distant low hum of cicadas that sounded like a warning. Inside the processing barn, Bessie moved with a deliberate, slow grace, her powerful arms swinging heavy bales with a rhythmic efficiency. Every day was a rehearsal for the journey she hadn't yet taken. She practiced walking silently across the creaking floorboards of the kitchen, learning to distribute her weight through the balls of her feet to minimize the sound. She experimented with different mixtures of animal fat and pungent herbs, testing them on the plantation dogs when the overseers weren't looking, noting which combinations made the hounds turn away in confusion. She was a scientist of her own liberation, working in the shadows of a world that refused to acknowledge her intellect. This wasn't a story of a woman who got lucky, it was the story of a woman who engineered her own miracle. The impossible survivor was already born long before she ever stepped off the plantation grounds. She was simply waiting for the catalyst, the one spark that would turn her years of silent observation into a fire that would burn through the chains of Virginia. And that spark was coming, hidden in the screams of a child and the snap of a leather strap on an afternoon that would change everything. The transition from a silent observer to a fugitive began with a sound that Bessie Williams could no longer ignore, the rhythmic, wet thud of a leather strap against the back of a 10-year-old boy. On August 15, 1857, the oppressive Virginia humidity seemed to thicken as an overseer named Dixon unleashed a torrent of disproportionate rage on young Samuel for the minor sin of breaking a water dipper. For 28 years, Bessie had survived by swallowing her fury, by letting the injustices of the Thornhill plantation wash over her like rain on a stone. She had practiced the art of invisibility through submission, believing that her time would come if she only remained patient. But as she watched the boy's mother, Clara, collapse in a heap of pleading despair and saw the twisted satisfaction on Dixon's face, something within Bessie's meticulously constructed armor finally shattered. She did not run, she did not scream. Instead, she moved with the terrifying efficiency of a mountain in motion. Before her conscious mind could weigh the consequences, her massive hand had clamped down on Dixon's wrist with the force of an iron vice, halting the downward swing of the lash. "That is enough," she whispered, her voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. In that single frozen moment, the hierarchy of the plantation was dismantled. A slave had touched an overseer. Bessie knew, with the cold clarity of a condemned woman, that her life as she knew it had ended. The silence that followed was more deafening than the beating had been. Dixon's face shifted from shock to a purple, vein-bulging rage, yet he did not strike back immediately. He was paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the woman standing before him. Bessie stepped back, the weight of her choice settling into her bones. In the antebellum South, the punishment for such defiance was not merely death, but a prolonged public execution designed to serve as a gruesome deterrent for others. Dixon's promise was clinical. Master Thornhill would make her an example, whipping her until her spirit broke, then selling whatever broken shell remained to the most brutal labor camps in the Deep South. But Bessie didn't panic. The 8 years of mental preparation she had invested now took over like an automated system. She realized she had a window of perhaps 12 hours, the time it would take for Dixon to coordinate with Thornhill and organize a formal correction. This was the trigger she had been waiting for. She retreated to her cabin, her mind already inventorying the cache of supplies she had hidden beneath the floorboards. This was no longer a dream of someday. This was a tactical execution of a survival plan. She understood that her only hope lay in the very thing everyone thought would fail her, her ability to move her 280-pound frame through a landscape crawling with hunters. As midnight approached, Bessie finalized her preparations with the focus of a chemist. The centerpiece of her kit was a small sealed jar containing a pungent, oily sludge, a recipe passed down by an elder named Jacob. This mixture of rendered animal fat, crushed red peppers, turpentine, and stolen ammonia was a weapon specifically designed to target the greatest threat to any runaway, the olfactory excellence of the bloodhound. Historical accounts from the mid-19th century detail how fugitives would use such scent blockers to create a chemical wall between themselves and their pursuers. For Bessie, this was not just a superstition, it was a calculated countermeasure. She rubbed the foul-smelling grease onto her skin and the hems of her heavy skirts, knowing that the turpentine would overwhelm a dog's sensitive nose, while the fat would ensure the barrier didn't wash away in the dew. She packed a small satchel with dried corn, salt pork, and a sharp iron blade. She didn't take much, for she knew that every extra pound was an enemy to her joints. Her plan was built on the subversion of expectation. While the plantation expected her to cower or flee into the nearest dense thicket, Bessie did the unthinkable. She walked out of her cabin and stepped directly onto the main plantation road, moving toward the very center of the county. The physical reality of her flight was a brutal reminder of the challenges her body presented. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Her knees, already worn by decades of labor, protested the pace, and her breathing became a heavy rhythmic labor in the cool night air. However, Bessie turned her sighs into a rhythmic engine. She didn't sprint. She maintained a steady, relentless gait that utilized the momentum of her weight. She chose the main road because she knew the psychology of the search parties that would soon follow. They would look for signs of a woman struggling through the brush, broken branches, and muddy footprints in the woods. By walking on the hard-packed dirt of the public road, she left no clear trail for human eyes to follow. She moved like a shadow, a massive, silent entity navigating the periphery of a world that was already waking up to her disappearance. By the time the first light of dawn touched the Virginia hills, Bessie had covered nearly 4 miles, a distance that would seem meager to a scout, but was a miraculous feat for a woman of her stature. She reached a wide, rocky creek 5 miles from Thornhill and waded directly into the water, letting the cool current soothe her swollen ankles as she began the next phase of her deception. Back at the plantation, the discovery of Bessie's empty cabin triggered a volcanic reaction from Master Thornhill. He did not see a woman seeking freedom. He saw a high-value asset that had dared to steal itself. Within hours, the call went out for Preston Marsh, the most feared slave catcher in the region. Marsh arrived with 5 men and a pack of hounds that had been bred for the sole purpose of human tracking. Marsh was a man of clinical detachment, viewing his work as a sport governed by logic. He surveyed Bessie's cabin and laughed when he heard her description. "A woman of 300 pounds, he remarked to his men. "She won't make it to the county line. She'll be hiding in the first barn she finds, gasping for air. We'll have her back by sundown." Marsh's arrogance was his first mistake. He followed the initial scent of the dogs toward the main road, but he dismissed the trail when it stayed on the open path. He assumed Bessie was too dim-witted to use the road, and that the dogs were simply picking up her old scents from daily chores. He pushed his men toward the woods, wasting precious hours searching the thickets while Bessie was miles away, standing in the middle of a river, preparing to vanish. As the sun reached its zenith, the hounds finally tracked Bessie's path to the edge of the creek where she had entered the water. The dogs, usually relentless, suddenly became erratic. They reached the spot where she had applied the scent blocker and recoiled, their sensitive snouts overwhelmed by the stinging vapor of the ammonia and red pepper. They whined and turned in circles, refusing to enter the water. Preston Marsh watched in growing frustration as his perfect tools failed him for the first time in years. He realized then that he wasn't hunting an impulsive runaway. He was hunting a strategist. Bessie, meanwhile, was nearly 6 miles downstream. She had utilized the water not just to hide her tracks, but to support her weight, allowing her to move further than her legs would have allowed on land. She found a dense stand of tobacco in a neighboring field and did what no one expected. She lay down in the middle of a row, hidden by the tall, broad leaves. She was less than 30 feet from a secondary road where hunters were already patrolling, yet she remained invisible. She wasn't hiding from the world. She was letting the world's own assumptions create a veil around her. The first 24 hours were over, and the impossible survivor was still free, while the best trackers in Virginia were already beginning to doubt their own eyes. Preston Marsh stood on the muddy banks of the Louisa County waterway, his boots sinking into the silt as he watched his lead hound, a veteran tracker named Caesar, recoil from the reeds. The dog wasn't just losing the scent, it was in visible physical distress, sneezing violently and pawing at its snout as if the air itself had turned into jagged glass. To a man who had built a career on the mathematical certainty of the retrieval, this was an affront to his logic. Marsh had spent 15 years categorizing the mechanics of flight, believing that every runaway was governed by a predictable animalistic panic. Most fled in a straight line, driven by a primal urge to put distance between themselves and the lash, eventually collapsing in the thickest brush they could find. But this woman, this 280-pound anomaly, wasn't running in circles. She was weaving a tapestry of sensory confusion that targeted the very tools Marsh relied upon. By the 3rd day, the frustration among the search party had curdled into a dark, volatile desperation. Master Thornhill, terrified that Bessie's escape would inspire a mass exodus, had increased the bounty to $200. This staggering sum, nearly 2 years' wages for a common laborer, drew out the worst kind of mercenaries, men who lacked Marsh's clinical patience but possessed a ravenous greed. They swarmed the county like locusts, yet they all shared the same fatal flaw. They were looking for a woman who was hiding in terror. They could not conceive of a woman who was standing in the light of the morning sun, daring them to recognize her through their own prejudice. The mixture Bessie had applied to her skin and clothing was a masterpiece of folk science, a chemical shield forged from the most abrasive substances available to an enslaved woman. To understand why it worked, one must understand the incredible sensitivity of the canine olfactory system. A bloodhound possesses up to 300 million olfactory receptors, and the part of its brain dedicated to analyzing smells is 40 times larger than a human's. They don't just smell a trail, they see a historical record of movement etched into the atmosphere. Bessie's scent blocker functioned by creating what modern chemists might call an olfactory whiteout. The turpentine acted as a volatile solvent, carrying the stinging capsaicin of the crushed red peppers deep into the dog's nasal cavities, causing immediate inflammation and sensory overload. The ammonia, surreptitiously gathered from the plantation's laundry vats, acted as a harsh base that neutralized the organic fatty acids and skin cells, the raft, that dogs use to identify a specific individual. Finally, the rendered animal fat functioned as a fixative, a heavy grease that ensured the protective barrier remained anchored to her heavy cotton skirts, even as she waded through dew-soaked fields or chest-deep creeks. It was a brutal, brilliant solution to a biological problem. Bessie knew the dogs were her primary enemy because, unlike the men, they couldn't be fooled by a costume or a change in gait. By blinding the dog's primary sense, she effectively neutralized the only searchers who were immune to human assumptions, leaving the men to rely on eyes that were already blinded by their own arrogance. On the 6th day of her journey, Bessie reached the outskirts of a small trading post near Fredericksburg, a hub of activity where news of the Great Escape had already begun to circulate. Most runaways would have circled the town by miles, losing precious energy navigating the dense, untamed thickets of the periphery. Bessie, however, chose the path of highest visibility. She had acquired a simple stained cotton apron and a wide-brimmed straw hat from a clothesline miles back, items that functioned as the universal uniform of the domestic worker. She picked up a discarded wicker basket, filling it with wild greens and heavy river stones to give it the weight of a legitimate errand, and then she simply walked down the main thoroughfare at dawn. To the white residents and the passing patrols, she was a familiar, unremarkable sight. A large, middle-aged enslaved woman performing the invisible labor that kept their world turning. Her size, which should have been her greatest liability, became her ultimate camouflage. The hunters were looking for a fugitive, someone skulking in the shadows, disheveled and frantic. They were not looking for the woman walking with a heavy, purposeful step toward the local dry goods store. She even nodded respectfully to a group of men on horseback, members of the very search party hunting her, and they barely spared her a glance. This was the invisibility of the mundane. Bessie understood that in the South, an enslaved person was only truly seen when they were out of place. By placing herself exactly where a domestic servant was expected to be, she disappeared more effectively than if she had been buried in the earth. Despite her tactical brilliance, the physical cost of the journey was reaching a breaking point. Every mile covered by a woman of 280 pounds is physically equivalent to 3 miles for a smaller person, particularly when the terrain shifts from packed road to the uneven, unforgiving floor of the Virginia wilderness. Her knees were swollen to the size of small melons, and the skin of her feet was a raw map of blisters and weeping sores. The muscle underneath that she had built through decades of hauling tobacco bales was the only thing keeping her upright, but even that iron reserve was being depleted by the sheer caloric demand of her flight. She managed her meager supplies with the precision of a military quartermaster, eating tiny portions of salted pork and parched corn only when the shaking in her hands threatened her balance. Sleep was a dangerous luxury. She rested in short, 20-minute bursts, often leaning against the trunks of massive oaks so she wouldn't have to struggle to stand back up. The humidity of the Virginia summer acted as a silent thief, stealing the moisture from her body and leaving her lightheaded in the midday heat. Yet, during these moments of near collapse, she didn't think of the miles ahead. She thought of the boy Samuel and the sound of the lash hitting his small frame. That memory functioned as a secondary nervous system, providing a surge of adrenaline that bypassed the lactic acid screaming in her muscles. She wasn't just moving toward a border on a map. She was moving away from a version of herself that was required to be a silent spectator to cruelty. Her body was a heavy burden, but it was also the vessel of her rebellion, and she refused to let it fail. By the dawn of the 10th day, Bessie Williams had reached the limits of human endurance. The physical toll of moving nearly 300 pounds through the rugged Virginia backcountry had transformed her body into a map of pain. Her knees were no longer merely aching, they were failing, and every step required a conscious act of will that felt like dragging a mountain. It was in this state of near collapse that she reached the small, weathered farmstead of Moses Grant. Moses was a free black man, a rare anomaly in a state that viewed his very existence as a threat to the established order. For men like Grant, the price of freedom was a life of constant vigilance and the heavy moral burden of aiding those who were still in chains. When he saw Bessie emerge from the mist, a woman whose name was now synonymous with a $200 bounty, he didn't see a payday. He saw a sister in need of a miracle. He took her into his home, risking his own papers and his life to provide her with the first warm meal and safe sleep she had known since leaving Thornhill. Historical records of the Underground Railroad highlight the essential role of these station masters, who operated not out of wealth, but out of a profound sense of shared destiny. Moses fed her, cleaned the infections starting to take root in her feet, and listened to her plan. He understood that the roads were now too congested with hunters for her to walk alone. The strategy for the next leg of her journey relied on a classic method of the Underground Railroad, the produce wagon. Moses Grant was a farmer with a legitimate reason to travel toward the markets of Fredericksburg, and he utilized this mundane task as a shield for Bessie's transport. He helped her into the bed of the wagon, covering her massive frame with sacks of grain, bundles of tobacco, and crates of seasonal vegetables. This method of transportation was a terrifying game of sensory deprivation for the fugitive. Hidden beneath the weight of the harvest, Bessie had to remain perfectly still, while the wagon jolted over rutted roads, her breathing shallow to avoid raising the dust or shifting the cargo. They were stopped twice by search parties led by men who were growing increasingly irritable as the trail went cold. Each time, Moses leaned on his reputation as a quiet, hard-working man, showing his free papers with a steady hand while the hunters poked half-heartedly at the tops of the crates. They were looking for a woman who was too big to hide, yet they failed to realize that she was hidden right beneath their hands, cushioned by the very crops she had spent her life harvesting. This irony was not lost on Bessie. She lay in the darkness, the scent of earth and grain filling her lungs, realizing that her invisibility was being facilitated by the very tools of her former enslavement. After Moses delivered her to a safe wooded perimeter miles beyond the search zone, Bessie faced the most treacherous stretch of her journey, the deep isolation of the northern Virginia forests. Hunger and exhaustion began to erode her tactical discipline. On the 14th day, she stumbled upon a small, isolated cabin where she met a woman named Margaret. To Bessie's clouded mind, Margaret appeared as a potential ally, a widow living on the margins of society who might harbor some sympathy for a fellow sufferer. Margaret offered her cornbread and a bed, speaking in soft tones that promised safety. However, the $200 bounty had created a climate where mercy was a luxury few could afford. While Bessie fell into a deep, much-needed sleep, Margaret's daughter was already sprinting toward the nearest town to alert the authorities. This moment highlights the brutal moral complexity of the era. Poverty often forced people to choose between their conscience and their survival. When Bessie woke, it was not to the smell of breakfast, but to the sound of heavy boots on the porch and the distinctive metallic click of a rifle being cocked. She had been sold for a year's wages, and the circle was finally closing. The escape from Margaret's cabin was a blur of adrenaline and desperation. Bessie realized the front door was blocked and threw her entire weight against the back window, the frame splintering as she tumbled into the dirt. She ran with a speed that defied her size, her powerful legs pumping as she crashed through the undergrowth. Behind her, the shouts of the bounty hunters erupted, followed by the sharp, terrifying crack of a gunshot. A bullet tore through the air, missing her by inches, but she didn't slow down. She burst through the tree line and found herself at the edge of a rain-swollen creek, the water churning with a violent, muddy energy. Preston Marsh and his men emerged from the woods, cutting off her forward path, while more hunters closed in from the sides. "Nowhere left to run," Marsh shouted, a look of triumph finally crossing his face. He had her cornered against a natural barrier that no person of her size could hope to navigate. He expected her to surrender, to collapse in the mud, and accept the chains. Instead, Bessie looked him in the eye and issued a final, defiant challenge. I made you look like a fool once. I'm about to do it again." With a final surge of strength, Bessie dove into the churning water. To the hunters, it looked like an act of suicide, a heavy woman surrendering to a current that was already sweeping away fallen logs. Marsh's men plunged in after her, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the force of the water, struggling just to keep their heads above the surface. They watched as Bessie's head disappeared beneath a cluster of debris, and they assumed the river had claimed its prize. "She's drowning!" one hunter cried out, watching the spot where her massive form had vanished. Marsh stood on the bank, his jaw set in a hard line as he watched the current carry his prize money away. He ordered his men to search the shallows downstream, convinced that her body would wash up on a sandbar by morning. He couldn't imagine any other outcome. To him, the physics of the situation were absolute. A woman of her weight, exhausted and battered, could not possibly survive a plunge into a river in full flood. He decided to camp on the bank, determined to retrieve the body to prove he hadn't truly been beaten by a runaway. However, Bessie's survival was not based on swimming, but on her intimate knowledge of the Virginia waterways. As a child, she had played in similar creeks and knew that the current often carved out deep, underwater ledges beneath fallen trees and rocky outcroppings. As the water pulled her under, she didn't fight the flow. She used her weight to sink to the bottom, where the current was slightly less chaotic. Her hands found the slick surface of a submerged limestone shelf, and she pulled herself into a small, air-filled pocket created by a massive log that had jammed against the bank. She remained there, submerged to her neck, breathing through a tiny gap in the wood while the hunters shouted and splashed just inches away on the other side of the log. The cold water sapped her heat, but the air pocket was her sanctuary. She stayed in that freezing darkness for hours, listening to the hunters discuss her death until night fell and their campfire burned low. Only then did she crawl out on the opposite bank, too weak to stand, but alive, and for the first time, truly believed to be dead by the men who hunted her. The silence that followed the hunter's departure from the creek bank was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Bessie Williams waited until the last ember of their campfire had turned to grey ash before she dared to move. Her body was no longer a functioning machine. It was a vessel of cold, wet agony. Emerging from her underwater sanctuary, she found that her muscles had seized in the frigid temperature, and her 280-pound frame felt like an anchor dragging her back into the mud. She could not stand. Instead, she began to crawl, a slow and primitive movement that took her away from the water and into the deep, lightless heart of the forest. Every inch was a battle against hypothermia and the total exhaustion of her nervous system. She was a dead woman in the eyes of Virginia, a ghost navigating a world that had already written her obituary. This transition from a hunted fugitive to a wandering spirit was the most dangerous phase of her journey. She had no scent blockers left, no food and no strength. Yet, as she moved through the dark, she was fueled by a singular, cold realization. Preston Marsh had failed because he believed his own eyes over the possibility of her brilliance. She had dismantled the reputation of the state's greatest tracker using nothing but a fallen log and the weight of her own body. Dawn brought a new kind of terror in the form of a man's voice. Bessie collapsed in a shallow ravine, her vision blurring when she heard the soft crunch of leaves. A black man in his 30s, dressed with a quiet dignity that signaled his status as a free man, knelt beside her. This was Daniel Freeman, a name that in historical accounts represents the vital link between the enslaved and the free. Daniel was a traveler on the same clandestine routes Bessie was trying to navigate, and he recognized her not as a bounty, but as a legend. The news of the drowned runaway had already spread, but Daniel saw the rise and fall of her chest and understood the miracle he was witnessing. He didn't hesitate. He knew that if he were caught with her, his own freedom would be forfeit. But the code of the resistance was absolute. He provided the warmth of his own coat and the life-saving hydration she desperately needed. Daniel didn't just offer help. He offered a transition into the organized network of the Underground Railroad. For the next 2 days, he became her shadow, transporting her in his own wagon, using his legitimate free papers to bypass the final thinning lines of the search parties who were now looking for a corpse rather than a woman. The final leg of the journey took Bessie into the care of the Quakers at the Hadley farm. Jeremiah Hadley and his family lived a life of radical, quiet defiance, viewing the assistance of fugitives as a divine mandate. At the farm, Bessie was given the medical attention her battered body required. Her swollen joints were wrapped in cooling salves, and her infected feet were finally allowed to heal. But more importantly, the Hadleys provided her with intelligence. They confirmed that Master Thornhill had officially ceased his funding of the search. The $200, a fortune that had nearly cost Bessie her life, was no longer on the table because the world believed she was at the bottom of a creek. Preston Marsh had returned to Charlottesville in disgrace, his near-perfect record shattered by a woman he had described as immobile. The psychological victory was complete. Bessie spent a week in the Hadleys' attic, watching the world through a small, circular window, realizing that she had not only escaped her chains, but had also escaped the very definition the South had placed upon her. She was no longer a cook or a laborer. She was a strategist who had outplayed a system designed by the most powerful men in the country. On the 37th day of her flight, Bessie Williams crossed the border into Pennsylvania. The transition was physically unremarkable, a line of trees, a shift in the quality of the soil. But for Bessie, it was the moment the world regained its color. Daniel Freeman stood beside her as she stepped onto free soil, watching as the woman who had moved a mountain of obstacles finally allowed herself to weep. The weight she carried had not changed, but the burden of being property had vanished. She arrived in Philadelphia not as a beggar, but as a survivor of a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. She found work in a textile factory where her immense physical strength, once the source of her owner's profit, now became the source of her own independence. She rented a small, clean room and began to build a life defined by her own choices. But she did not forget those she left behind. She became a pillar of the Philadelphia abolitionist community, her home becoming a secret classroom for others who arrived at the border terrified and broken, convinced that their own limitations would be their undoing. The fallout in Virginia was a slow, agonizing rot for those who had tried to break her. Master Thornhill never recovered the $4,000 he had squandered on the search, nor did he ever recover his standing among the planter elite. He became a laughingstock, the man who lost his most valuable asset and then paid a fortune to hunt a ghost. He died 5 years later, bitter and hollow, never understanding that he hadn't been beaten by a runaway, but by a superior mind. Preston Marsh, the man of clinical logic, left the slave-catching business entirely. He could no longer stand the mocking whispers in the taverns of Charlottesville, the questions about how a slow woman had made him look like a novice. Bessie's escape had done more than free one person. It had exposed the fragility of the entire system of control. It proved that the machinery of slavery relied on the arrogance of the masters, the belief that they were the only ones capable of complex thought. By subverting that arrogance, Bessie had created a blueprint for resistance that would be whispered in slave quarters for decades to come, inspiring others to look for the invisibility in their own lives. The legacy of Bessie Williams is best captured in a moment from 1863, following the Emancipation Proclamation. In a crowded Philadelphia square, a young pregnant woman named Mary approached Bessie. Mary was terrified, recently escaped and feeling the heavy toll of her journey. She told Bessie that she wasn't brave or strong, like the legends said Bessie was. Bessie took the girl's hand and looked her in the eye with a gaze that had seen the bottom of a flooded river and the barrel of a hunter's rifle. "I was terrified every single hour," Bessie told her. "My body wanted to quit and my mind told me I was a fool to try. But I realized that their biggest mistake was thinking they knew what I was capable of. They saw my size and thought it was a cage. I saw it as a shield." Bessie's final lesson to the next generation was simple. The world will always try to tell you who you are based on what they can see. Your freedom begins the moment you realize they are wrong. Bessie Williams lived the rest of her days as a woman of substance, a woman of intellect, and a woman who proved that even the heaviest chains can be broken by the weight of a determined mind.